Hey, Vanessa.
Hello, Adaam.
First of all, welcome to Uncertain Things. This is the podcast where we commiserate together about the state of the world. Today, we actually don't have anybody. We are being had by Kyle Huber.
That sounds weirdly sexual. Not in the biblical sense, but the podlical sense.
The podlical sense?
I don't know. The podcastical sense.
So Kyle Huber had us in the podlical sense on his podcast, the Adventure Creator podcast. He is a lovely bloke who has been listening to Uncertain Things for a while and also happens to create his own pod about people passionate about their work. Apparently, we have exhibited some signs of unbridled passion in previous episodes. I think that might be a conflation of passion and rage, but I did not protest. And we did a little Zoom with him a few weeks ago to discuss our work, the pod, some of the lessons that we have been gathering over the past year, and our origin story, and generally the things that just make us tired and pessimistic about existence. So he published it, and you can find it on his stream, which you should follow on the Adventure Creator podcast. But also he allowed us to share the episode as published here on our stream. So this is what it is. This is a little bonus episode that just guest stars Kyle's pod with us. And the timing is fun because we are coming close to our 1-year anniversary as a podcast, and that's awesome. And to celebrate it, we're going to publish next week an interview that I had recorded when I was in Israel with Tomer Persico, who, as longtime listeners of the pod know, was our very first guest. And we originally started the conversation with him about the image of God and how that little germ of an idea evolved and shaped the discourse of liberal Western culture. And last month, I had a chance to catch up with him and see how his book is doing and get a little more granular. So if you like that big picture philosophical conversations, you've got something to look forward to next week. But for now, we're going to share with you that little bonus episode from Kyle's podcast. And we apologize. We recorded it over Zoom. And as you'll notice, it's not with our normal equipment. So we apologize to that. That's definitely on us.
That's all on me. I forgot my microphone that day. And so that is just podcaster's number one sin. I apologize for that.
Yeah, as I mentioned on previous episodes, Vanessa is currently traveling the East Coast on many an adventure. So adventure creator that she is.
I can't wait to be home, by the way.
Back at you. So without further ado, follow us on uncertain.substack.com, wherever you get your podcast. If you feel kindly, give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It gives us the chance to reach more people, and that's awesome when it happens. And and if you're feeling materially generous, you can also support us on Patreon. With that, and we're Uncertain Pod on the social media, which doesn't matter because we hate social media. Okay, with that, Kyle and I guess us.
More us.
Welcome to the Adventure Creator Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Huber. Today, I get the opportunity to interview two self-titled Jaded journos and the hosts of the Uncertain Things podcast to learn all about their background and what actually drove them to start a podcast centered around uncertain things. Basically, the premise of their podcast is everything's broken, now what? So, in the news, everywhere you look, it seems like there's issues, and it's so overwhelming sometimes to actually ask the question of like, okay, so what are we going to do about it? And what I love about Adaam and Vanessa is that they push back on their guests. They, first of all, find fantastic guests to host on their show who are experts in their field. But they have just extremely thoughtful and insightful questions, commentary around things that I have a hard time sometimes articulating how I feel about. So long story short, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I wish we could have talked for another 2 hours. I hope that there's a part 2, a round 2 with Adaam and Vanessa at some point down the road. But in the meantime, you can listen to them. You can definitely, I would recommend subscribing on Substack, which, if you haven't heard of it, is an alternative platform based around just like sharing information and not censoring it. That's kind of what I'm understanding is Substack's a place where you can actually maybe articulate or exercise your First Amendment, your right to free speech. So we talk about that. We talk about the importance of free speech, what role the individual has in parsing through information to make their own informed decisions, to what extent the two-party system limits government's effectiveness. And I think, kind of the punchline or the theme of the entire conversation can be summed up with something that Vanessa brought up, which is a question: why do we fight for a liberal democracy? Why do we think it's the best system? And Vanessa goes into why that's a super important question that she has brought up with a lot of their guests. So all that to get out of the way finally and introduce Adaam and Vanessa of the Uncertain Things podcast. Here we go. Adaam and Vanessa, welcome to the show. It's a fantastic opportunity to talk to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't believe the randomness of coming across your podcast, because I was just, I very rarely do like the browse or the explore tab in Apple Podcasts. And for some reason, one day, maybe the algorithms knew I was into uncertain things. And so your guys' podcast popped up there. And I read a few reviews. I thought it sounded cool. And I think you have 35 episodes now, and I've listened to a handful of them and highly suggest. I love your guys' podcast. And I'd love to hear a little bit first just about each of your individual backgrounds for some context on where you're both coming from, because I do think our upbringings really inform our perspectives on the world and our ability to cope with uncertainty and deal with ambivalence. So maybe Vanessa, you start, and I'd love to hear a little, what was life like growing up?
Oh, what was life like growing up? I grew up in Long Island, New York, suburb of the city. Grew up to a Northern Irish dad and a Peruvian mother. And so even though I grew up on Long Island, I was definitely not of the Long Island culture, which I think is, kind of, I feel like common for a lot of people who go into like writing and media. When you're not exactly fitting in, you find ways to observe and comment. But yeah, so I grew up on Long Island, went to school in DC, ended up living in Chile for a few years, which was pretty formative for me. And then while I was living in Chile, I decided I wanted to get into journalism. I had gotten a job in Chile very, very randomly at an architecture journalism gig. I knew nothing about architecture and I knew very little about journalism, but they just hired me because I spoke English, and I started like writing long form essays every week. And that's how I kind of got my feet wet into the journalism world. And at some point I was like, well, I'm learning a lot on my own, but I feel like there's more to be learned here. So I applied for journalism school, and I applied to only one. I applied to Columbia, and I was like, well, shot in the dark. If I get in there, probably going to look good on my resume, so I should probably do that one. And then I weirdly got in. And so I moved to New York City, met Adaam in journalism school. I think we both commiserated a lot about how interesting the experience is. Let's put it there for now. We can put a pin on that and come back to it if you're interested. And then we ended up moving in together. And then that's kind of, once I kind of got my feet wet and was starting to enter the journalism world in New York City, I kind of started carving this niche for myself in kind of like cities journalism. And I got a few jobs like at a design magazine. And for the last few years, I've been working at a urban tech company, making their podcast for them. It's called City of the Future. And I got a chance to work with Benjamin Walker and Andrew Calloway of the Theory of Everything podcast, who are two awesome guys, and they taught me a lot about podcasting. And since then, I've kind of been really trying to make more and more podcasts, and that's the thing that I am most focused on and interested in for my professional trajectory.
Did you mention having written the actual book about podcasting history?
I had a brief moonlighting gig, I guess, after journalism school, where I applied for like a fellowship thing from the Brown. Oh gosh, I've already forgotten what it is.
Brown Institute?
The Brown Institute. It's like affiliated with Columbia. And I just asked them if they would give me money to study the history of the podcasting industry. And they said, yeah, why not? No one had really done it at the time. That was like 2015. And so I got to compile this little like small history of where podcasting had been in the past, and where it was going in the future in terms of its business models, which I think is always fundamental to whenever you're thinking about where a content form is going. And that was a really fascinating project, but it's hopelessly out of date. It's only, oh God, age 7 years later or 6 years later. And it's already like the industry is so different now. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of one of the things that I did early on before I actually got into making podcasts, because I just kind of wanted to understand the ecosystem of podcasting.
But you're underselling how funny that moment was, because first of all, I was there when she pitched that. The head of the Brown Institute was sitting there, and she like her eyes were lit up. It's like, this is incredible. Like
Tao Center. I remembered Tao Center for Digital Journalism.
Right. The Tao Center.
Yeah, that's what it was.
The Brown Center is for innovation. Tao Center is for research. Right.
Yes.
Nobody has taken podcasts at that point seriously as a new medium storytelling, even though, at this point, like podcasting was becoming super popular with Serial. So it was no longer a niche format, but it was still not being really discussed or studied in a serious way. During that research, I remember Vanessa was constantly getting like calls and approaches from people who were like, the pioneers of podcasting, each of them wanting to make sure that their name is inscribed in history, because this was the first time that a scribe was coming to collect all the names who have created this movement. And people were like, I was there first. I officially recorded myself on a tape recorder and sent it through mail. Anyway, it was a really funny moment. Yeah. Because there was no proper history of it.
I didn't realize how controversial the origins of podcasting is, but there's a lot of infighting about who was in there first. But yes, it was a really interesting project. I'm happy to talk about it. But yeah, it was a really cool project.
So you were a gatekeeper for the podcasting industry early on, is what I'm hearing.
No, not at all. But I was at least someone that was like, hey, we should be taking stock of what's happening here, because it has the potential to be huge. And I mean, at that point, it wasn't like I was already coming in pretty late on the bandwagon. I mean, Serial had been around for like a year or so. So like I think that was a really pivotal moment in podcasting history. Also, just having the app when Apple made the podcast app like native to the phone, that was also a pivotal turning point. So it was an interesting moment to like stop and take stock. But I made some conjectures about where it was going, but I don't think I could have anticipated the extent to which there'd be this proliferation of networks coming out, and this proliferation of different types of shows and content production, and like the Spotify's getting in there. So I would love to like do part 2 of that study, to be honest, because I think what's happening in the podcasting world is pretty fascinating. I'll be really interested to see where it goes.
Yeah, and I'd also love. Yeah, go ahead, Adaam.
No, I'm also wondering, because there's now a lot of what I would call probably like some sinister or like crypto sinister conversations about regulating the podcasting industry, and remember we were talking in one of our conversations with Matt Welch, and there was just this headline about I don't remember exactly the headline, but it was something like podcasting is one of the last forms in which controversial ideas get through, or stuff like that, which constantly implies that there is a push from the actual traditional gatekeepers, to find a way to limit the ability of people, say like Tom Cotton, for instance, to have his own podcast, or at least to be able to say whatever he wants on podcasting, and for servers to be holding them. And this is kind of scary, but if there's a future to this, then maybe you should wait like 5-10 more years to see what happens, and then write the death of podcasting.
I think another technology that will also be really like transformative, kind of for the reasons that Adaam's hinting at, is the transcription and like AI and like automatically generating transcriptions. Because I think part of the reason why podcasting feels kind of special and hidden is that when you don't have the kind of visual written traces, I guess, of the conversation, it feels a bit more ethereal and kind of can fly under the radar.
Who knows how much hate speech is floating around
in around minute 47 of this conversation? Who gets that far? Let alone like you said, finding podcasts. It's like it's like a small miracle that you found us on Apple Podcasts just browsing, because like how that feels, at least to me, it's like a rare way to to find a podcast these days. So,
but also to be fair, the people who are searching for hate speech and everything, they hear like they're very progressive in their listening, and progressive in the sense of the professional way. Like they listen for hate speech jazz. It's like it's what you didn't say.
The between the lines.
The lines.
I agree that podcasting, there's a certain, I guess, like use for it, right? And I think one of the most powerful things about it is the ability to have these longer form discussions where you can hash things out in more than 140, 280 characters. And if we have a disagreement, I can clarify myself, and you can like see my face here, at least on this video call, and be like, okay, I see his intentions. He might be dead wrong about this, but his intentions are coming from a good place. I always love to have conversations about controversial or uncertain things. And I don't think I
do know that you need to pay us for every time you mention the name. Right?
Or we should all take a
royalty.
shot, one or the other.
But basically, yeah. And Adaam, I also want to get a little bit of context on your background, because when I travel abroad, I'm able to have more open discussions with people. People are like, so what do you think about politics in the US? Like they'll literally ask you that, and you can expound for a couple minutes and they'll listen and then share their opinion, and it's super healthy. In the US, it's like, why are you talking about that? And it's almost cliche to have meaningful discussions about politics. And so I'd be interested to hear like Adaam coming from not growing up in the US, and then walk me from your childhood and then up to the point where you call yourself jaded journalists. I love that term. And I kind of want to understand, like, how did you guys end up identifying as a little bit outside of this, like, I don't know how you want to call it, mainstream narrative ideology conglomeration of just like following sort of what's set out. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. But
yeah, I'll start with the thing that you didn't actually intend for me to latch onto, but you just said about not being able to have conversations in the U.S. and more freely outside of it. I think I understand what you were referring to, and I do think that historically I felt a lot more freedom having conversations about things and having, heterodoxical ideas outside of the US. I think there's something slightly moving. I don't know. I can't put my finger in it quite yet, but I've met with a bunch of Americans recently that from, areas that I did not expect to be, the hotbeds of open thinking and creative discussion. And I think something about the hyper pressure of the past couple of years in the US has made Americans like start abandoning the idea of let's not talk about politics during Thanksgiving, that the politics and money, those are the things that you don't talk about. And I think this is changing in a way that maybe right now it's still trying to find the right degree, and we're still negotiating what's tolerable. But I don't know. I think something is moving in an interesting way, because I've heard a lot of families where you have one kid who is very much like Blue Lives Matter and parent who is very Black Lives Matter. They're trying to find ways to not hate each other, but they also, neither of them find it tolerable to not talk about what they believe. So they have to develop a new social strategy that just did not exist historically in the US, not in the 20th century at least, to talk about the issues. And I think potentially that's a good thing. While in the world that I've seen, which is the Middle East and Europe, there is somewhat of a regression when it comes to those things. When I think that there's an adoption of some of the worst memes in American culture, conversational memes. There's an ersatz attempt definitely in Israel, and I'm seeing it in Europe too, to kind of imitate the progressive language and the restraining power of American elites, because that seems cool, that seems trendy, that seems where the power is. And the imitation of that is no less dangerous than the original. So anyway, my story. I was born in New York. My parents met at NYU, and I was born here. But my mom is Israeli, and they separated at a pretty young age. I grew up with her and my grandparents in a lovely neighborhood in Jerusalem. And that's the landscape of my youth. I don't know what you know about Jerusalem, but when it comes to perspectives, there is certainly a diversity of them. It's very difficult to go about your day without getting into an argument about something with someone. It's a combination of being in the middle of a very real conflict with a lot of high emotions, constantly engaging you. But also, I think there's something about the combination of, I guess it's like the old Jewish Jerusalemite culture of studiousness and rabbinical argumentation on one hand, and something about the Middle Eastern, maybe even the Mediterranean, very like high tones, high energy, very direct, and put all of those together, and you just develop a habit of having an opinion, whether it's justified or not, and then sharing it. And then when somebody cuts you down and tells you you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about, you learn to take it and say like, I guess I didn't know what I was talking about. That's kind of cool.
Or to push back.
Or to push back, but to an extent. But I do think that one of the things that you learn from this, most importantly, is the joy of being wrong, being proven wrong, or understanding when you're being bested. You learn how to take defeat constructively. I was just defeated, but it kind of feels good because now I know something or experienced a perspective that I did not consider before. Moving to the US, which I did like 7 years ago for Columbia, because I was working as a writer and an editor in several magazines in Jerusalem, and Haaretz was one of them, and I wanted to. I don't know. I was writing in English, and if I'm writing in English, I want to try working with an English-speaking industry, and that's it. And from there, I started working at CNN, and currently working on the show Axios on HBO. This is kind of like giving me an inside view of how the media industry in the US works. It also put me there at a very interesting time, which was 2015, 16, when basically the world broke, and especially the media world, because throughout the Trump run for office, I was spending most of my days watching his rallies or the shows that I was working on at CNN. I was editing some clips, but also constantly looking for news. And the interesting thing that I started realizing is that there's a real dissonance between the way that most of the people around me are talking about Trump and the way that he is. Like, I felt like there was a mold that he was being fit into, because of all the bad vibes that justifiably people were getting from him, but that they were also not paying attention to what he's actually saying, or not even trying to make a real effort to understand what his appeal is to the thousands of people that were filling up his rallies. We would spend way more time trying to disprove his claim that his rally was full, trying to find those shots of like, look, that part had a little bald spot, clearly was not full to capacity, rather than trying to understand, yeah, sure. So maybe it was 2,000 people instead of 3,000 people, but it was still 2,000 people that went there. Try to understand what they found in him, why they was probably like 20,000, not 2,000, but try to understand why those 20,000 people were there listening to him give a speech. And, you spend so much time with the guy as I did. And like, you get it. Like you get when he's making a joke, you get when he's trying to be provocative and he's doing things that are understandably attractive to people and hitting their concerns and hitting their uncertainties, hitting their fears in a way that nobody else was. You can also add to that the level where you can see totally that it's disingenuous, that he is a manipulator, that he is a demagogue, that he is exploiting those people, that I would even psychoanalyze and say that he's completely patronizing these people. He's condescending to them, but he was still doing something real. Whatever that was, it was being ignored by all the people that I was working with. That was where I started to feel like that there is a dissonance between the reality that we're trying to cover and how we're doing our job.
The other thing, though, I think that, Adaam, that's very fundamental to your story and your pathway to Jaded Journo, is the startup that you tried to get off the ground. I mean, I think that's a pretty fascinating story that I think is a very like proto model for uncertain things in some ways.
At the very least, it's the thing that made me really admire Substack. So for a while,
yeah,
I was trying after around 2018, I joined two other brilliant journalists to try and build a startup that was intended to be the kind of thing that I want Uncertain Things to be, which is like, an anti-partisan, ideologically fluid place for conversation and for looking at the news in a different way and hopefully expanding the conversation beyond just the narrow lanes that the news tends to slide into. And it failed. But it didn't fail because we didn't get an audience. We were able to get like, I think 6 to 8 million monthly readers on the website. But where it failed was to make money. Probably if we had the same model 3 years ago, 3 years before that, before Trump came onto the public stage or escalated down to the public stage, we would have been able to make a shit ton of money from ads, for instance, easily with these numbers. After Trump, advertisers became more reluctant to put their money on any kind of news because there was also this entire discourse about fake news and Russian bots and all that. So people were becoming very scared. And the only place where money was to be found was either if you're already an established legacy outlet, and even there, the money was drying up. But the New York Times was kind of doing okay, and plus they had the ability to capitalize on subscriptions. So they would be fine. And on the other side, if you're so far to one ideological bubble, then you would get advertisers that clearly are trying to get to these people. So if you're 100% leaning to the right, then you'd get money from, gun companies and anti-abortion groups. And if you're leaning all the way to the left, you would get money from Planned Parenthood or anything that is considered politically toxic. But anything in between, and that meant anything from local news to startups like ours that was trying to do something that is anti-ideological, but also kind of anti-establishment, those things would get nothing. We found ourselves, me and my co-founders found ourselves at a crossroads where we had to decide, are we going to give up or lean into an ideology to be profitable? My partners decided to go and let's lean in. And at first I tried to play along with it. At some point I was constantly pulling back and say, come on, we can't do that. That's way too nasty. That's too ugly. This is what we were trying to fight against. And then they told me, you are holding us back, which in fairness, I was. So we broke ways. That next to the CNN experience made me see that there, between established media and an attempt to do something independent, there's really not a lot of chance for at least what I would consider real, open, non-ideological, non-scripted conversations. But then there was Substack. The moment that I saw the first article on Substack, which I think was from the Dispatch, which is a conservative outlet that decided to create an entire business model around Substack, I was like, I get it. I read their mission statement when they first came out. It was by what's his name? Stephen Hayes. So I read Stephen Hayes' statement, and Stephen Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, his co-founder, they both were old school conservative media figures. They worked in big name brands there, so they felt the suffering, the pains that I was describing for years, and then they decided to go all in on the Substack model. And the moment they said it, I was like, this is what we need. This is the only way to make slightly subversive news. This is the platform that gets it. And I told Vanessa, you should join me.
It coincided with the pandemic, which I don't think we can ignore, right? There was a period of time where we were working from home, schedules were crazy, but wanted to explore things that were more meaningful to us because, your day job can kind of be a grind sometimes. And I remember it being a conversation of let's take this time that we have and let's try and dig a bit deeper into the issues and topics that we really care about. And the original conversation, as I recall, was let's make a blog. It was going to be a typical Substack, not a podcast. It was going to be kind of writing. And over time, it's just taking time to write and think meaningfully takes a lot of time and effort and energy. And it was also how much we felt like our well was a little too dry because it was such a confusing moment in history. And at least for me, I felt like there was so much going on in the summer of 2020 that it was actually hard for me to write. And we were kind of both gravitating to maybe we should reach out to other people and just get other perspectives that can help us navigate through this uncertainty. But I don't actually remember the exact pivot to podcasting, how it happened, Adaam.
Oh, I remember. So yeah.
Go ahead.
So because
sorry, Kyle, is that okay? We're kind of
please. I love hearing this stuff, and I just want to jump in and just say funny how you guys can have different views of something that happened a year ago. And I think that's a theme, right? It's like, how can we, see things differently and still come together? So keep going.
Yeah, but also Vanessa has a record of being wrong about this.
Well, I have a flawed memory, but
No, but it was not exciting. It was just Vanessa. I remember when I finally got her started, and we were like discussing, so what could it be? What we'll be looking at, and then she just like threw in as an aside, and could it have an audio component? And I was like,
right, because I'm always into the podcasting,
right?
Like that's my.
And thing. I was like, yeah, sure, maybe we'll see. And we were not really like actively thinking about doing a podcast. We were like, at most, some of the if we ever do an interview with somebody, we'll have maybe the recorded interview that will end up like turning into a story attached to that story. That's what we were thinking. And then I was just like, I don't know, I guess out of the excitement of like, yay, we have something, and I like the name Uncertain. And so I started just emailing to a lot of people that I wanted to talk to. And one of them was Tomer Persico, who is this religion scholar who was at Berkeley at the time. And I just randomly wrote it, like, would you like to come and we can argue about things? And he said, like, happily, actually, I'm just about to release a new book. I would love to talk about this. And I was like, great, let's do it like tomorrow or something. I don't know. and we're just like immediately just turned it into a recording. And then we're like, we'll record it and then we'll publish it. And then maybe we should just record it. And as we were like trying to decide what to do with Persico, I was already getting like responses from a few other people that I reached out to and was just stacking up. And one of them was also Tom Holland, who I've been trying to get for an interview for like months, long before I had the Substack. I was like, I just reached out to him. I wanted to interview you about your new book. And then, the scheduling was a problem it was even before the pandemic. That's how long it took me to schedule. It was like, I don't know. I don't remember the month, like probably from November of 2019. And so it was like a while. And suddenly I got a response from him. I got a response from other people. And we found ourselves, Vanessa and I, with a weekend where we had like to record like 3 or 4 interviews on one weekend. And I was like, holy crap, we can start a podcast with this. And that was it. It was like, you know what? Fuck it. It's so much easier to record conversations than transcribe them and then have to write an intro and then like turn it into a story and have things. Just fucking have the conversation.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. And I think also like it really did scratch kind of an itch that maybe we didn't even know that we were itching for, but just this opportunity to reach out to people who are so interesting and have really just engaging conversations. And what's been interesting to me is that like a lot of times these conversations go on beyond the podcast. Like we've met up with some of the people who've come on our podcast. We've like these conversations have continued in our like living room, which is always something that like Adaam and I talk about a lot because we're roommates, and something that, bonded us as friends was that we believe really strongly in community and like having a sense of people around you that feels so hard to achieve in this day and age. And like
especially in New York.
Adaam in Jerusalem had it. I had it in Santiago. And so coming to New York, we just felt very much like unmoored, I think, on a let's see without like a core group of friends, because I guess people are coming and going. The city is hectic, and it's been interesting. I think with the podcast, we've actually had an opportunity to kind of start creating a kind of virtual and New York-based network of really interesting people. And that's been, I don't know, for me, that's been something that I wasn't anticipating to come out of the podcast that I think is really cool.
Right, absolutely.
That's fantastic. I was listening to Matt Welch, Perestroika Starts at Home today. And I love kind of the dialogue that you guys had back and forth. And I'd love to take the conversation a little bit in a different direction, just to propose the question to each of you. Maybe Adaam can start, but what role does the individual have to parse through information to make their own informed decisions versus what role does whether it's the media, the government have, or to make sure that we're consuming the truth when we all know that the truth can be very subjective and dependent on your perspective. So what role do you think? Yeah.
Right. And the context of this from our conversation was I talking to Matt Welch, who is, I think, editor at large, if I get the title right, at Reason Magazine, a lifelong libertarian and one of those amazing journalists. And like he has a in his brain a catalog of everything from 60s LPs to all the books about the Cold War that were published in the 80s. It's like he's one of those brilliant guys, and but he's also extremely like a true believer in the power of freedom to lead individuals into the, not, I wouldn't say ideal situation, but to kind of like resolve things, and but that any alternative to that is ultimately more damage and more pernicious than just letting people have their own responsibility on their actions and their consumption of information. Whereas I came from the perspective that we are currently in a struggle, like I think culturally, socially, with our media. We're almost in conflict with our media, because not in the sense that the meat, like that some right wing conspiracy theories want to play it as if like the shadow, the Illuminati running the media, like they're trying to control you, but simply in the modes of consumption that we have for media, like social media and just our smartphones. There's something there that is totally hacking and breaking our brains and making it very difficult for us to not obsessively consume it, but also making it incredibly more difficult to sift through in order to find through the feeds and find actual value and find truth in it. And I think that this is something that at this scale, at this degree, we never had to face as a civilization, and to treat it as if it's just another not minor, but it's another natural evolution. It's just like the printing press. We now have a new technology, and we just need to have a few hundred years of adoption, but then we'll be fine. We'll adapt and we'll be able to thrive off this technology. And I think not necessarily. I think it could also completely derange not only our media consumption habits, but also our conversations with each other, and make us more alienated, make us more angry, make us more anxious in ways that
you're pretty concerned about this, right?
Yeah, no, I don't want to overstate it. We're not going into a tech apocalypse necessarily, but I think we could end up in a much worse place than we started.
What do you think, Vanessa?
I think it's like a shared responsibility. I think as I recall from the Matt Welch conversation, I think Matt put a lot of onus on the individual, right? Like the individual really has to do their due diligence to find, sources that are legitimate, to not just believe crap, to change the channel when you're watching something that's clearly, biased and or not doing the work that it's supposed to do as journalism. But I think, while all that is true, that's going to take a cultural shift, and I think there has to be some institutional shifts as well. So I think it's going to have to come from journalists taking more responsibility and kind of outlets taking more responsibility for thinking through their business models and the approaches that they take, and what is being rewarded. That I think is a huge part of this conversation, because media has to change its business model if we're going to actually have sustainable news sources that are legitimate and have real facts. And I think there's going to have to be a push in education. I don't think nobody taught us in school how to think about what is a good source of information, what is a bad source of information. That seems like a pretty simple thing that one should incorporate into a curriculum. It doesn't seem like out of this world to me. And then I think that like tech has responsibility for this too. I think there's like a lot of, being somewhat familiar with the tech industry, there's a lot going on in tech in terms of thinking through things like, privacy by design, for example. Like whenever you start a new product, you should be thinking about how you're embedding privacy from the beginning of the conception of the product, and you shouldn't be tacking it on at the end. And I think tech in general is kind of going through this tumultuous period where it has to think through what are the potential outcomes of the thing that we're creating. And when tech interfaces with media and the way that it gets to individuals, that means that tech platforms, primarily social media platforms, but they need to be thinking about the way they're putting forth the information, what people are gravitating to, and again, how they're rewarding the content and the behavior. So I think all of these things kind of have to happen in concert. I don't think you can only put the onus on the individual.
I totally agree. I think that's really well said. And I love how you kind of directed it towards education, because growing up, I went to public school my whole life. And I was just always sitting in my desk. Teacher tells you, here's what's going to be on the test. What I used to say is regurgitate the information. Yeah. And when I was 16, I had what many might call an awakening of sorts, an opening of my mind. It began with questioning my Catholic upbringing and starting to ask questions about things that are said in the Bible. That was during like a small group. And then that led me to just like, basically the pendulum swung way out to like, I don't want to say specific conspiracies, because there's so many uncertainties with conspiracies, which I actually, that word gets demonized unfairly sometimes. But the pendulum swung out. I was in my friends' faces telling them, you got to believe in this and this. And I became known as the conspiracy guy, and went to college, grew up a little bit, 19, 20 years old. I didn't want to bring that same identity to a new social group. I went 2,200 miles away from home to Indiana to get away from all of it. Not that I created a bad reputation. I still had a great friend group and everything, but I wanted to start fresh. And the pendulum started to swing back a little bit in the sense of how pushy I was about my opinions on other people. And I'm just trying to kind of like, I bring this up because, we're talking about how, and I think Adaam, you had an awesome quote on the Matt Welch episode. You said something like, technology is causing the emotional social conflagration, I think is the word you used, that we're experiencing right now. Maybe that just, came right off in stream of consciousness and you don't remember that. But I love that. And at the same time, as my pendulum swung out, it came back naturally. And so I'm not as worried about people starting to believe in things that are too out there if they're not translating that to action in the real world. Like, there's the cliche example of doesn't matter if someone believes the world is flat, but if they are creating a religion around which everybody has to believe it, otherwise, whatever, then that's where the issue becomes, or when you're pushing it on other people. So I guess, what is to you a bigger, or, where do you see the balance between the issue between people believing crazy things, which clearly happens, smart, intelligent people can get deranged, as you've said, but also good information can be unrightfully censored, as we've seen time and time again as well. And then you don't have access to stuff that might be just a little bit outside of the narrative. Think, for example, the Wuhan thing. I mean, I don't know much about it, but one day it's like, this is no chance, this is a conspiracy, there's no chance this is true. 9 months later, the same news outlet is saying this is possible. So I don't know, all that rambling to.
And many news outlets actually revise their previous, or like crypto edited some of their previous statements about it, which is really, ethically problematic.
Right. They go back in time and change the website and things like that. Yeah. And the same thing on the World Health Organization. They'll go and change web pages, and that type of stuff for me erodes my trust in these institutions.
Yeah. It's a problem. And it stems so much, and actually I had a conversation yesterday with Batya about this, Batya Ungar-Sangron, and we interviewed, and I think a lot of it stems from a combination of arrogance and insecurity, in the sense that, and how insecurity breeds more vanity. And I think there's something right now in the media that people who went into that world thinking that this is just being there, or being entered into the club, imbues you with some authority over analyzing society and predict, or at least having some expertise into how politics works, how society evolves, what is true and what isn't. And then with like one event after the other, realized how fragile that, or non-existent, how fictitious that authority is, from Brexit to Trump to this cascade during the pandemic of shattering traditional authorities. They realized that it doesn't work this way. Like the going into an institution and absorbing its I wouldn't say biases necessarily, but its complacencies about the world doesn't make for good journalism. It makes for very smug and lazy journalism. But for a lot of people, it was it. If I'm there, and I talk like those people, like I'm a 20-year-old intern entering CNN or the New York Times, and I see how people talk there, and I imitate it, and I start emulating their behavior and their thought patterns. Then I'm part of that club. I mean, that's a bad thing. That's a bad thing. And the only way in which I think a new generation of journalists tried to push against that was only insofar as they brought in too much academies into the workplace. And that, we don't need to get too much into the whole critical race theory discussion, unless you want to, because I think critical race theory is an excellent theory. I mean, it's a worthwhile academic endeavor that I spent. I think one of our intros, I think it was for our Moshe Sluhovsky interview, America Rewrites Its Past, like trying to defend. I think like it's getting too much of a bad rap because of some of its abuses by people. But it's a great academic endeavor. But when you try to take it and then because this is the thing that you've learned back in university and now try to cram it into the work of journalism, then you're doing a disservice both to journalism and to the theory. And I think that's the only way in which I can see that, broadly speaking, of course, that people are trying to defy against the complacencies of those institutions. And for the most part, they're actually trying to negotiate those complacencies with critical race theory or with the academic critical theories, neither of which really gives you, I think, a better understanding of the way most of America thinks, or the way that some of the certainly doesn't give you, for instance, a better perspective of international affairs and geopolitical realities about like China, for instance, and keeps you completely blind to the possibility that if, say, a lab leak happened in Wuhan, which we obviously don't know, but if it happened, then obviously just knowing the way that the Communist Party comports itself, obviously the response to it would be complete silencing of everybody involved. And just because for Americans such a response is so unthinkable, or to even think about it means that you're in some way being bigoted towards the Chinese government, which is absurd. How can you be bigoted to such a country that is larger than you, more in certain ways more powerful than you, and certainly has all the authoritarian capacity over its own denizens? So to even have that thought that this is how they behaved is racist, or bigoted, or you're just thinking because they're Chinese then they're more nefarious. It's like, no, it's because they're an authoritarian government that they're more nefarious. But anyway, those patterns of thought are just completely screwing up our ability to have serious conversations about the world. And I hate that cliche, having conversations. Like, this is like kind of like the lazy way to say, trying to actually see the world for what it is and run against people who disagree with you. But but it's just like everybody says that we need to have conversations about this, and I'm just tired of hearing it coming out of my own mouth.
I mean, I'll echo a lot of what Adaam said, and I think for me, so this is something that like I was not as aware of, or like I just wasn't as aware of what was going on, I guess, before I started this podcast. So I am a left-leaning person. I'm very forthcoming about that on the podcast. I say I come from kind of like a liberal background, and that is where like my people have been. And I guess I was less clued in than Adaam was about the ways that a lot of mainstream media is only speaking to people on the left in a way that is not only excluding people, but excluding narratives and excluding facts. And that was something that I was not as attuned to until I started the podcast and started talking to other people and trying to like getting other perspectives. I'll echo what Adaam said about this coupling of authority and insecurity. I think it's something that Martin Gurry talks about very eloquently in our conversation with him. I recommend that episode because that that the institutions that we have are still 20th century institutions in their ethos and their foundations, and they're not prepared for the 21st century, and they are struggling, and they are grasping onto their claim to authority in a way that clearly isn't resonating with people anymore, and they haven't yet figured out what's the 21st century like media institution, for example, going to look like. um and I agree with Adaam in that it's coming, that reality is also coming up in heightened friction with this kind of project of justice, I guess. That's kind of coming from the left, I would say, broadly. And I think I'm incredibly sympathetic to this, because it's about fucking time that we have like conversations about justice in this conversation. But it's also that objective is also kind of coming at the expense of open dialogue. I think it's kind of become that you're either on this team or you're not, and that attitude, I think, is ultimately destructive, not just for our country, but also for the outcomes that people want, who are seeking greater justice of racial, economic, and everything. So I think it's destructive for its own purported desires, as well as for our country as a whole.
I think that's a trend I see a lot too. Like things that proclaim to be liberal are illiberal, and things that proclaim to be progressive can actually be censoring or silencing or something. So go ahead, Adaam.
Yeah.
I actually want to respond to what he just said, but first, I said I want to retract, or not retract, but I want to mitigate something that I said earlier, and I said that when you bring things like critical theory into journalism, it does a disservice to both, and I don't fully believe that. I do want to say that I actually think that there is a lot of worth in bringing some of the thought of critical theory into journalism, in the sense that it looks at historic patterns and systemic inequalities, and I think that, to the extent that journalism was not looking into those things, it should have. And this is actually a very important revolution, of intellectual revolution that totally belongs in journalism and in the way that you're analyzing reality. So I want to, first of all, to clarify that.
But maybe it's just not the end all be all is what I'm taking away from.
Right, exactly. So there is no end all be all to anything. So anything that becomes the end all be all of anything, it is by definition totalitarian, and that's a bad idea. That's when you are looking at only one goal and when one energy of activism to guide everything you do, then you are a proselytizer or a fanatic or a fundamentalist. But you're not doing journalism. Journalism, you're supposed to be drawing on all your the tools you have to analyze reality and see how they interface. Sometimes maybe not even have an opinion about it at all. But I think having an opinion as a journalist is very wise and important. But also be very clear about all the things you're doing, and ideally not excluding any available mechanics that you have to be thinking about the process, and say I think this is one available way of seeing the world, but also look, this is a little more complex, and things are not as there is no just one authoritative narrative. But the thing that you said about the liberal being illiberal and progressive regressive, it's just a trick of language, right? This is so depends on, first of all, depends on what you call progressive. The idea of progressive is ancient. People were I think people were using that word at least from the late 19th century. So clearly, I don't know what they think about themselves, and how people who using the word today feel about people who've used it in during the Woodrow Wilson administration in the early 20th century. Do they see kinship to them, or do they understand that this is the linguistic history of it or not? It doesn't matter, but that's just a artifact of language, as is liberal, and the fact that we use liberal here very different than we use liberal in Europe. And I think when I try to use the word liberalism, I'm echoing, I think, the European concept of it, which is just the more fundamental. I hate saying classical liberalism because it's grating on the tongue, and again, and a lot of people are abusing that phrase as well. But that's, I think, what we mean. It's something that prioritizes openness and conversation, and thinking that there is a more potential for social thriving when things are more open, but both from in the perspective of markets and governance and discourse. Actually, I don't know if you've read. God, me and names is terrible. Jonathan Rauch's book, the Kindly Inquisitors. It's a fantastic read to anyone who hasn't. And he really he wrote it, I think, in the late 90s as a response to some of the early runs of political correctness. And he's describing the liberal model of the world more beautifully and more, I think, incisively than anyone else. So I highly recommend it.
This is something that actually I've learned a lot about in the course of doing the podcast, and that I've actually found really interesting, because I don't have I think Adaam's education was much more well-rounded than mine was, and so I feel like for me there's like certain like fundamentals that I kind of skipped, and in the way like some of this podcast is kind of starting to fill in those gaps. Like, I'm not saying it's filled in all of them, but it's like starting to like sketch them in. And one of them is just like, why do we fight for a liberal democracy? And I know that seems like such. I think I asked this in our first interview with Tomar Persico, and yep. I know it's like a fundamental question, but I think so many of us take for granted that we live in a liberal democracy and don't fully unpack like what it means and why we have it, and why so many people fought so hard to have it. And so it's something I press our guests on a lot. Like, what is worth preserving? Like, why do you think the liberal democracy is like the best system that we have, even if it's like never going to be the ideal system? And so I've gotten a lot of answers on that. And I actually do think it's like a fundamental question to be asking right now, because it's at risk, right? I think a lot of the actions of what's happening now in media and conversation in politics is putting the liberal democratic project at risk. And I think unconsciously and unthinkingly, people aren't realizing that that's the potential outcome of where we're going. And for me, I think it's an important thing to talk about, like why this system is the system we have, and what's worth preserving about it, and how do we modify our behaviors and our conversations and our politics in order to ensure that we don't, throw away the baby with the bathwater, if you will.
And it's important because we were talking a lot about the left, because it's always so appealing, because I think a lot of it comes,
we like ripping on our side.
We like ripping on like the side that we grew up around. But it's so important that this taste for illiberalism is clearly a bipartisan thing. It's clearly something in the moment. There is just an attraction towards the authority and the authoritarianism. And I think this, again, Martin Gurry explains this as the failure of the 20th century institutions of liberal democracies to live up to their own promises in the mind of the public. And the public, rather than recognizing that the promises were overblown, but the system is still perhaps the best that we have, go with, well, the system failed us completely. We might as well get an authority figure to take over. And a story that I like telling, that I will never forget. This is actually still from the left, but it's stuck in my mind. And I'm actually losing sleep over this sometimes, because to understand that we have such people around. And it was a really wealthy German industrialist that I had dinner with once, and he in New York. And we were talking about we were talking about China. And I was saying that obviously there's a problem with Chinese authoritarianism. I'm not saying that we should go to war with it, but it's scary that its financial power is actually proselytizing other countries to adopt some of its worst practices. And he said, I'm not sure that I agree. So like, what do you mean? Well, and mind you, he's German, which I think adds an important layer to this. It says, well, there are things like climate change, where we can see, and this was still when Trump was in office, we can see how fickle democracy is, allowing people like Trump to take office and completely abrogate all the project to protect climate change. If we had a strong leader that could only take care of the common good of, in this case, climate change, then we'll be in a much better place. Look, China actually fights for climate change because it has one person in charge who knows what's important and takes care of it. And I was like, I loved it. I was like, I loved having that the taste of what it felt like to live in the Weimar Republic for a second. But I was like mind blown That they could be saying that with a straight face. But it's equally happening on the right, and the talk of the week is Tucker Carlson going to Hungary to just jerk off to the pictures of Viktor Orban there, and I'm like, this is also mind blowing that this has become the model for the new right. This is not a good thing. Like, I mean, there are many things that are beautiful in Hungary, namely the architecture, and there are some beautiful people there, and there's a lot of talent and art, but the Viktor Orban model is not one of those beautiful things. Not certainly not for anybody who has liberal values, but also he literally defines his democracy as an illiberal government, or liberal. I don't know if he calls it democracy even, but an illiberal whatever regime. But also on the standards of the right, like Viktor Orban's government is a government of graft. It's venal. There is nothing there that is more complex.
That speaks conservative values.
That
really.
It's just like wraps venality with conservative values. This is not something that anybody who really cares about, I don't know, family values, community, a more equitable society, which presumably the new right cares about now. None of this is exercised there. This is, kiss the ring and you'll get a job. This is it's jobbery, and in the lamest kind, combined with some authoritarianism and strongman destruction of the media. But apparently, for the new right, destroying old media institutions is really all that it's about. It's about owning the libs. And in sometimes in a very literal sense, just like owning the libs. And it's crazy to me that this is getting traction.
Yeah, there's a analogy to the WWE wrestling. It's like the two-party system is basically a WWE wrestling match, purely scripted, made for theatrics. I resonated a lot with that years ago, and it still sticks with me when I think about. When I think about like the voting system, I imagine, we're in this you have two choices and there's a million different issues out there. And so my question is, to what extent is the potential for change limited by the two-party system? I know one of the questions you guys ask, and I want to ask it as well. So here, start brewing on it. But you guys always ask people, what are the blind spots on the left and the right? And so I want to kind of like, get your perspective on, can we continue this two-party system in the way it is? If you could wave a magic wand, what would your, doing this podcast, talking to all these different people, what would you sort of say are the limitations of the two-party system, and how would you change it?
I also like that you turned the question on us.
I'm going to let Adaam, you should answer the two-party system, because I don't have a strong, I know you've had arguments with my fiance on this multiple times, so I feel like you could answer that one, and then we should both answer the blind spots question.
Okay. Oh, so you want, I was going to do the opposite order, but okay. But the party system is, so Vanessa's fiance, Zev, who we had on for the episode you mentioned earlier, maybe it was, off air, the freestyle. Theocracy.
Yeah.
He believes strongly in what you just suggested, that existing within the framework of a two-party system limits not only our option, but also our intellectual horizon. And then we end up thinking in binary terms, and that is a problem. I think there is some truth to that, but I think it could be easily overstated, and is by people like Vanessa's lovely fiance. Because I don't think you see any less binarism in places like Israel or Germany or France, where you have multi-party systems. I think the tendency towards us versus them is just in human nature, and whatever ways or whatever fault lines we use to delineate those differences will exist. It will be fine. That narrative will find a way to emerge. And with it's post mass media. When mass media is industrialist media, we're talking about like social media, where the entire conversation has been globalized, where we were living, people in Israel using the terminology of American culture war to describe local politics. We've completely eroded any like borderlines in the way that we think about the world, and to me that means that we're now kind of converging into a place where so much of the online world is going to be thinking about good and evil, right and wrong in the same terms. And I've been saying that a lot recently, that I think, at least speaking for Israel and Europe, there and the US, we're going to a place where the two sides are the American left and the European right. We have the European style of nationalism with a flavor of authoritarianism, and we have the American left with the progressivism with a flair of authoritarianism. And those are the two tribes that you can choose from. So I don't think changing that two-party system will have any real effect. No. So that's my answer. Blind spots. Vanessa, do you want to take the first go?
Well, I'm struggling because I have an answer for the left, but I don't know if I have a good one for the right yet. So maybe if you go first, it'll jog some ideas.
So for me, I think the easy answer is they both have the blind spot that they don't see how similar they are or how much they need each other, and the worst of their ids mirror each other. But for the left, I think they have too much faith in expertise and theory, and they don't see the human flaw inherent in expertise and in theorizing. And a great book that I've been reading recently is Darkness at Noon, that I just love. Tomer Persko actually recommended it to me, and it's written by Arthur Kessler, and he describes the journey of actual Soviet socialist who's being on trial, put on a show trial, accused falsely of trying to assassinate Stalin. But because he's one of the original authors of the Bolshevik Revolution, he's putting everything that he's going through, including the corruption of the state, into logical terms and trying to fit it into his theory, because he's so committed to, the truth of logic. This is the inevitable end of our theoretical understanding, and even if that means the destruction of my own body and of everybody who came before me in the name of that theoretical ideal, I accept it because it is the logical end. So it's fascinating, and I think you see a lot of that pathology in leftist thinking. For the right, it is their blindness to, I think, authority. It's just seeing how power in itself, in its most naked form, is addictive to them, and that distorts what they claim to be their values. Like, they're sometimes, in many cases, you see how the values of the right are subservient to power itself. And I think that, to me, explains a lot of the rise of Trump.
Oof, those were good ones.
Yeah, you did a great job articulating both of those. Sorry, Vanessa, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Agree with that. I mean, I'm still struggling on the right. I think because I'm still like familiarizing myself with that world a little bit. And so I feel like I don't know if I can really like put my finger on a blind spot that resonates for me on the right yet. But I will say for the left, there's two that kind of are sticking out to me that I think are, I guess, kind of personal to me, and like me recognizing my own blind spots as well. I think the number one thing is a lack of self-awareness about the narrative that is being pushed on the left. There's like an unawareness of how exclusive it actually is, because it couches itself often in the language of inclusivity, without really being aware of the ways in which it is actually excluding a lot of people and shutting down conversation and progress. So I think that's like probably the first thing I'd say. And the second thing I'd say is I don't think the left realizes how little optimism it has. Like, I don't think it really has come to grasp with how cynical it's become and kind of apocalyptic, I guess. Like, this is something that's really struck me talking to conservatives. And granted, we've been talking to really like thoughtful, intellectual conservatives who don't necessarily go the way of like that you think of when you think of the worst of the right now. But something that struck me in talking to them is that they're optimistic about certain things. They take a step back and they think about how much good there is left in the country and in certain institutions. And I think that orientation of, there like this positive outlook towards certain things that exist, and that not everything is doomed and going to be terrible, and like the world's ending tomorrow. Like I hadn't really realized how ingrained that was in leftist thinking. And so for me, it's kind of been refreshing talking to people who aren't necessarily stuck in that. Like, and don't get me wrong, climate change, I believe, is 100% real, and that we are kind of doomed if we don't get our shit together. But at the same time, doesn't mean you have to go around the world with your framework of everything being so negative minded. There, you can take the time to appreciate what is working well and what we have and what we've won.
I really like that perspective. And if I can, I want to ask you guys what we did learn from this last year in 2020. There was obviously an event that had a certain response to it. And one of my concerns is that right now, at least, it's early August, that some of the lessons that I think might be obvious around shelter in place, around taking kids out of school, things like that, they weren't as effective maybe as we had hoped them to be at the beginning. And I worry that we've just basically not learned what we could have from this past year. Do you think that that's the case? Or are you optimistic that we are going to be able to handle this in a more ideal way next time or in the future?
I don't know if we've learned our lessons. I'm I guess I'm defaulting to my old, pessimism here, but I think our response has been so fragmented and state to state and even city to city that maybe there'll be lessons learned on smaller scales. But I think across the US, I don't think we've formulated a response that we can like a positive response that will then be replicated. I am unfortunately skeptical of that. What do you think, Adaam?
I don't know. I don't like trying to prognosticate.
These are just your opinions too. I don't mean to ask you to.
No. I'm trying to think. I do think I will. I'll steal away the question and take into my pet horse of,
please do,
authoritarianism, and just say that I do think that this is something that worries me. That whether or not we took all the right lessons that we should have, we definitely have taken some wrong lessons from. And I think one of those is an embrace of how easy it is to curtail certain civil rights, and not just how easy, but how necessary it is sometimes. And it's become much more accepted in daily conversation to say, yeah, but it's for public health, so you should just take it. You should just just tolerate having it's circumscribed for you where you can't go. Well, what's the big deal? Just don't go to that coffee shop. Just don't go there. But and I don't think we are on the march to China right now, but I do think that it's a problem.
I agree, and we've seen this play out so many times, right? Just think about post 2001 9/11, just the sentiment around going to war. That's now we look back 20 years like, oh, well, probably was not the best plan of action at the time. And I see things like things that are being thrown around casually around like mandatory vaccines, for example. And maybe we're going to get the algorithm's going to listen to the transcription and censor this podcast just for saying that one word. Right. No, I'm kidding. But I see that as a very egregious assault on what I consider to be a critical freedom, which is the right to choose whether you want to have a medical procedure or not. And, for different people, I really value the individual's freedom to choose that. And I really I guess, kind of agree with what you're saying, Vanessa and Adaam, where it's like we are right now in this like heightened state of like, okay, there's emergency crisis. And this happens all the time. This is the machine, right? This is the war machine that sent us to every single war since yellow journalism. I don't know if you've ever heard that term. And the Spanish-American War, when William Hearst said to his photographer, "You furnish the photos, I'll furnish the war." And so we've seen this thing happen over and over again. When the public is in a state of fear, policies are justified. And then after the fear dies down, we realize it's not such a big deal. Those policies are still in place and it's hard to unravel them by the nature of our democracy. So I guess I'm just asking, like, so are you optimistic that like we're still going to have freedom in like 5 years? I guess that's my question. Like, we're not going to with China, but like, to me, podcasts like you guys, and open discussions, a lot of what we've talked about around like the new media landscape are critical to preventing this trend from going in the authoritarian direction. And I just firmly believe that. And I wonder what you guys think, or if it is going to just naturally rebound, or I don't know if that's.
You know the cliche. I think it's attributed to, is it to Ben Franklin, to whoever it is? It's attributed to the Republic if you can keep it. This cliche is like, it's so true. I mean, well, obviously all the mythos of the American founding is based on the lessons of the Roman Republic. So we know that the loss of freedom depends on the public. The loss of freedom is when the public loses the appetite for freedom.
Because government is naturally going to continue to acquire power, right?
Exactly. And government never wants you to have your freedom. It's not in the nature of government. Government wants to be paternalistic. And then you can argue whether that paternalism is good or bad, but it never wants you to just like, you know what I want to be a leader that just sits back and doesn't do anything and doesn't interfere and doesn't like raise taxes and like you just live your life and I'll just be a nominal leader. Like that's not in the nature of power. Power wants to assert itself. Power wants to grow itself. So what always scares me, as I keep going back to it, is the loss of appetite for asserting your own freedom and for protecting the freedom of your friends and your neighbors and your country and your like fellow countrymen and women and whatever's in between. I do not trust in establishment institutions to try to protect that narrative. I definitely don't trust corporate America, who for some reason has become kind of a hero on the left during the Trump era because oh, look at all those sponsors who are leaving like Ingram's the Ingram angle or the Tucker Carlson show. It's like, oh, so heroic. It's like these are not institutions that are going to care if democracy is overturned tomorrow.
As long as they can keep making profit. Right?
Exactly. I'm always running the scenario of let's say that Trump ended up succeeding in stealing the election. I see them as, I believe, like they would have, like right now they said like immediately after January 6th, they said, we're not going to give any more money to Republicans who supported the insurrection or whatever. I like if the tables have turned and Trump remained in office, managed a way to maintain his power, they would have found a way to justify to themselves that they can keep making money. As Orban's Hungary shows, like you can be very profitable in corporate, or China for that matter. You can make a lot of money under certain forms of autocracies. So definitely don't trust those institutions. The only way to keep, I think, the value of freedom is through human to human interaction, where you see the value in other people and you see how important it is for them to be independent and autonomous and with their own ideas and with their own desires and dreams in the world. And you want to protect that, and you want things to not become homogenized and to be made in your image. And I'm afraid that it takes us back to the Matt Wells conversation, that the fact that we're constantly being separated by alienating devices and we're having less and less personal interactions is decreasing our desire for that.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say that it's very easy to get sucked into an hour on scrolling on Instagram, on 5 hours on Netflix. It's very hard to choose to go out and mingle with people. I mean, especially in a pandemic, obviously, but like in general. And I mean, with my city's background, I mean, we've literally carved it into our built environment. We've separated ourselves from each other. We don't necessarily have as many like plazas and shared gardens. Like we don't run across each other as much anymore. And I am worried that like the way that we've gone into our devices, so too will be echoed in our cities and in our neighborhoods. And I do think that is incredibly problematic for the future. That said, I am more optimistic on this score than on your previous question. I don't think, there's like a 5-year timeline in which we descend into authoritarianism, but
that's, if I was 16 years old, I would have told you like shit's in the fan tomorrow.
Get
build
your money out of the bank.
You're saying like the idea that scrolling in the political, like our political mindset right now is that getting angry on Twitter and quote tweeting someone to slam them accounts in our mind to a political action, and going out and meeting people doesn't. And I think it's exactly reversed. This is the most stultifying thing you can do, scrolling on Twitter, whereas actually just going out and having like a beer with random people and just to have striking conversation with random people at the bar and with the construction worker who's just finished his day and then with the bartender and whoever, like that actually is much more politically valuable than the 2 hours you spent on Twitter today.
I agree so much. Even if you don't talk about politics, I think just building relationships with different people opens you up. And I think that's fantastic. So we've taken so much of your guys' time. I appreciate going over a little bit. I'm just really excited about this conversation. I've had a blast.
Fun,
but I want to ask.
Yeah, it was really fun. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, awesome. I'm glad you guys enjoyed. Hopefully my, one of the things I was concerned about coming into this, I'm like talking to like 2 seasoned vets over here. And I was a business student, all this stuff around journalism is self kind of taught, I would say. I'm super passionate about it, but I don't have the background. So I appreciate you guys entertaining my maybe somewhat amateurish questions at times, but you guys did an awesome job explaining some stuff. And I think there's going to be just so much more progress in the conversations, the discussions that you guys are having on your podcast. So keep it up. But last question.
Sure.
If Mark Zuckerberg dropped into your DMs tomorrow and said, hey, you can take the Facebook headline across the world, every single person on Facebook and Instagram, every single social media, whatever, sees one message for the whole day. Like, what would you write to the world? I got it from Sam Harris, I believe. Not a question I came up with.
Did Sam Harris answer it?
But don't be too precious. I don't remember. It's always the interviewer who asks the hard questions and then won't answer them. That's what I do. Yeah. I don't know what I would say anyways. Maybe something like breathe. One of the things I'd say is just breathe, right? Just take a big deep breath and just.
Yeah.
I think that's a powerful thing by itself.
I actually think that the country could use a lot of that. Like if ever there was a need for a chill pill, it's right now. I don't know, like something like you're wrong and it's awesome.
Love it. Love it. It's fun to be wrong. I think that's
to be wrong.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the only thing that's coming to me is just because it's on the heels of our previous conversation, which is just like go outside, talk to somebody new. But it's not super pithy.
Seriously.
I don't think Mark would be super enthralled with the idea. So I'll workshop that.
Go outside, talk to someone, period. New. Seriously. Right now.
Both of those are better than whatever most people are probably going to see at the top of their feed.
Delete your Facebook, maybe.
What gave me extra trouble with this is that there is nothing that gets me angrier than seeing Facebook trying to talk to me. Whenever I get a message that says Adaam, it's been 5 years since. Shut up! Do not talk to me.
Yeah, I hear you.
I fucking hate that. It's just such one of those like creepy things that the corporate America has decided is appealing. And I don't get it.
I'll just wait till the robots are out.
Yeah, right. Right, exactly. The turrets from Portal start. Hello.
Fantastic.
Okay. Thank you, Kyle, so
Adaam,
much.
Vanessa, thank you guys so much. And where should we find you guys on? Instagram's the main spot, and then also Substack, which I'm gonna disclose right now. I have not followed you guys there yet, but I will today. Yeah, I just listened on the Apple Podcasts, and so I'm excited to dive deeper.
I mean, yeah, it's fine. It's like wherever you get your podcast, we're Uncertain Things. The Substack, if you prefer that method, is uncertain.substack.com. Our Twitter and socials are Uncertain Pod. We are not Twitter and Instagram animals. Like every once in a while, I have a friend who we had on the podcast, Ken Goshen, who is an actual proper influencer. He has amazing art, and he keeps pushing me. You should do the Twitter and Instagram thing. Do the work. And I'm
like, it's like pulling teeth. I hate it. Adam's better than me.
It's like. But I can't.
This stuff, guys. You guys are great at the podcasting. So
thank you.
Yeah, but it's just don't expect some thrills in the socials, but you should still follow us.
No thrills.
100%. Yep. Cannot recommend the podcast enough. Again, guys, thank you so much for taking
so
time
much,
on
Kyle.
Saturday.
Yeah, you and your purple background.
You too.
Have a great day, and we'll talk to you very soon.
And come say hi if you're ever in New York.
I will.
Good.
I shall. It's going to be a bit, but I'll be there.
Bye.
All right, bye.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things via the Adventure Creator Podcast. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts because remember, you can make a difference too. Until next time, stay sane.